Today, I'm upcycling my old trusty joiner's mallet with these BBs to make a dead blow mallet. I built this mallet 30 years ago and it has served me well, but earlier this week I built these three mallets to replace it. A small one, a medium which is this size, and a large one. Watch the video for that if you'd like to, but what am I going to do with this? I don't want to throw it out, I don't want to burn it, and I've decided what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a dead blow mallet with it. And so today we're going to route holes into each side of this. We're going to fill those with BBs. We're going to close those holes back up with some walnut as some decoration, and then we're going to take one of the faces and we're going to face it with this thick leather and create ourselves a dead blow mallet.
So the first step is to head over to the table saw to take a 1/4 inch off of each side of the mallet. This does a couple things. First of all, it removes the heavy chamfer that is around each of the sides. It also allows us to have the same thickness mallet when we glue on the 1/4 inch worth of walnut to each side later in the project. And most importantly, it allows us to route the holes into the mallet that will hold the BBs for the dead blow action. I then needed to lay out the area that was going to be routed out to hold the BBs. I would like to say a lot of science went into the volume and the weight of the BBs in the mallet, but it really was rather random. I did leave a good inch between the cavity and the two faces. I wanted that to be stout enough that it would not get damaged when the BBs hit against it during the dead blow action. So the next thing was to route out the two cavities that will hold the BBs. I had a 1/4 inch bit already chucked up in my DeWalt 1 1/4 horsepower plunge router, and I decided just to leave that in there. And as the time went on, very slowly routing out that first side, I had time to think a little bit, and I realized that I really should have gone over and drilled out most of the material with a Forstner bit over on the drill press. And so that is what I did on the second side. It ended up going much quicker, and it also was a lot less wear and tear on the router bit, and on me. They both came out well, and they both are perfectly capable of holding BBs. Before I could glue things up, I needed to mill out the two 1/4 inch walnut faces that will cover up the two cavities that are holding the BBs. I took both 1/4 inch pieces out of 3/4 inch piece of walnut, and I resawed it on the table saw before planing both sides down to 1/4 inch on the planer. After tracing the profile of the mallet onto the 1/4 inch walnut pieces, I took them over to the bandsaw to cut out each of the profiles. Both of the faces of the mallet still had saw marks on them, so I cleaned those up quickly with a hand plane. And then I filled one of the cavities with BBs and did a little testing. Sounds good to me. In all seriousness, I did a lot of thinking about exactly how full to make the cavity. I figured you didn't want it 100% full or the BBs wouldn't be moving to provide the dead blow action, but I didn't know how empty to make it, so in the end I just did my best guessing, and the end result seems to be pretty good. I'm using Titebond regular yellow glue for the glue up. I'm putting glue on both surfaces just to make sure there's adequate glue and they don't have a dry joint. The most nervous part of the glue up for me was making sure that none of the BBs escaped when I flipped over the first side to fill the second cavity, but things went just fine. The other thing that took some care was just making sure that the faces that I was gluing on stayed aligned with the mallet head. I had to readjust my clamp several times in order to make it so that everything lined up. But in the end, they did, and I'm happy. I took a few minutes to clean up the excess glue, and then I let the sides sit for several hours before taking the clamps off. Things are sounding good. Cleaning up the walnut that overhung the mallet was easy to do. I have a large 2-inch flush trim set up for my router, and it does an excellent job for cleaning things like this up. I then took my cutting gauge and I marked the thickness of the leather off of the face that I was going to glue the leather on, and I took that over to the bandsaw and cut that off before heading over to the edge sander. After removing the bandsaw marks from that face, I then cleaned up all of the surfaces of the mallet head, and I finished everything up with 180 grit sandpaper on the edge sander, and things were nice and smooth and ready to move to the next step. I was then back over to the router table to put a 45-degree bit on so I could chamfer the head of the mallet for gluing the leather on. I'm using yellow glue to glue the leather on. Both the leather and the end grain of the mallet head that I'm gluing to are very porous surfaces. And so I put a very thick layer of glue on both sides, and then I just let it set for several minutes so that it could soak into both of those surfaces. I took this time to make myself a cup of coffee and enjoy things for a few minutes before clamping it up. Once again, I needed to take some care to make sure that the leather stayed lined up with the head. It was sliding around a little bit, and I didn't have a lot of tolerance that I left on the leather when I cut it. I ended up having to readjust the clamp several times to make sure that the leather was just where it was supposed to be. After cleaning up the glue, I let that set for several hours before taking off the clamps and heading over to the edge sander to clean up the leather. I first flushed up the leather with the wood, and then I went around to the 4 edges and I put a bevel onto the leather that extended onto the wood about a 1/16 of an inch. Then I was down to hand sanding. I sanded the head with 280 grit. It was already pretty smooth coming off of the edge sander with 180 grit on the edge sander, and so that sanded up pretty quick. In order to get the years of dirt and oxidation off of the handle, I decided to actually plane that. I needed to be careful not to plane up into the area that stays in the head, because I didn't want that to become loose in the mortise in the head. And so I planed the lower part of that, and then I cleaned the rest up with sandpaper. As always, we finish up with finishing. The finish that I'm using is a mixture of boiled linseed oil, mineral spirits, and polyurethane, but I have no idea what the proportions are. I did an excellent job of not labeling the bottle when I mixed it years ago, and I haven't known what it was since. I put several coats of finish on, and then I finished it up with some finishing wax, and it is looking good. In the end, a dead blow mallet's not really worth it if it only looks good, and so I thought I'd test it against one of my other new mallets, and it turns out it does pretty good with transferring all of the force into the block rather than bouncing off. Gotta say, I'm pretty happy with it. So thanks for stopping by and checking it out. I encourage you to check out the video of the making of the 3 mallets. I'll put a link to that video down in the description. This is Todd Wolf with Made by Wolf, encouraging you to get out there and to make something today.